Oh, yeah, should we all do? I think you guys should sit wherever you're comfortable. If you want to sit up there.
No,
Okay. All right.
So welcome everyone to the launch of, where is my prop? Pinko, issue 3. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is the space you are in right now. The Bureau is an all-volunteer queer bookstore. We've been here since 2014. We've been in existence since 2012. Our regular hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open later when we have events such as this. Because we are all volunteer, we're always asking for donations. Donations and sales are what keep this boat afloat. So there's some change in here, and I'll pass that around. There's also a Venmo QR code in here if you want to use that. And for those of you watching online, we're at BGSQD on Venmo. So I'll pass that around if you're able to give something great. If not, no worries. And if you'd rather support us by buying books or say Pinko magazine, that's a wonderful thing to do as well. Before we get started, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a call for a ceasefire in Gaza. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. We also want to recognize that today, May 1st, is the 208th day of Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people, funded by our tax dollars and enabled by our government's unwavering support. We hope that you will join us in calling for an immediate, permanent ceasefire, an end to the siege, and an end to the occupation in order to stop the collective punishment of Palestinians and to ensure the swift delivery of desperately needed food, water, medicine, fuel, and humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Michelle O'Brien up to the stage to introduce this issue of Pinko. Please give them a warm welcome.
Hello, everyone. Let me acknowledge it's been a very intense week. So thank you for everyone who came out. So we're very excited after a long delay between issue 2 and issue 3, long enough that we put out a book that's in fact there after accountability. We're very excited about issue 3 being out. It's been out for a minute, but we've been busy. We had a party, and this is our first sort of focused reading on the book, so a launch in many ways. And yeah. So thank you so much for coming out. It's an incredible issue and it has a wonderful mix of things. You can check out the table of contents, and 3 of the editorial collective members are here tonight, and we're all going to read a few pages from pieces that we were involved in. Many of the pieces that we're reading from tonight, except for Max's, Lou and I are reading from collectively written pieces. Okay, so Lou will start us off with the editorial and our Palestine statement. Yes.
Everybody hear me all right? All right. So I'm going to read from first our editor's note, which this has been a very protracted time of sort of disorientation and pain, and also a lot of amazing kind of glimmers of collective action, which, in other words, is hope. But it's just strange to kind of return to this editor's note and think about how much time has passed, but how it still feels like we're in the moment in which we wrote it together. So I might skip over some sections here, but I just wanted to read the parts that really sort of capture the spirit in which the issue was put out into the world. We write from a time of war. War reveals we previously worked in suspended time between intensities of an ongoing project of elimination. When we began preparing for this issue, the predominant mood was one of foreboding. As the transcript of our roundtable on political violence and queer self-defense shows, 2021 to 2022 was marked by the rise of a new, highly public fascist mobilization against trans people in the United States as elsewhere. All sides grimly invoked Weimar Germany. And yet, as we put the issue to print, a far greater catastrophe unveiled itself: mechanized aerial civilian slaughter in Palestine, the fascist signature from the moment air power was invented. If fascist domestic march threatened the return of the old in a new guise, Israel's naked genocide of Palestine and Gaza shows exactly how the old violence, which has made and sustained this world, promises to lay siege to the future to hold off anything new. A particularly hideous image emerged in the first month of the war. It seemed to be directly targeted at us, like some perverse form of atrocity propaganda. An Israeli soldier in fatigues and ill-sized helmet, boots on fresh tank tread tracks, unfurling a crinkled rainbow flag within the name of love written in Sharpie. The first pride flag in Gaza, some fools cooed. Who could this image have been for? We were disgusted by the idea that this bullet-toothed genocidaire might have thought he had something to offer the queer Palestinians whose bodies, families, land, dignity, his presence pulverized. And we were repulsed further by the thought that he had done so under some name we shared. If this is pride, then it is a source of immense indelible shame, the kind of sin which takes generations to repair. But in his naivete, the soldier expressed the real inverted content of so many bourgeois concepts, as Zionists often do. Freedom for some means slaughter for many. The promise of pleasure means the reality of agony. History means oblivion. Security means death, and on and on. Rather than ceding this man the conceptual ground he claimed at the price of over 20,000 Palestinian deaths this year alone, after 75 years of theft and torture, we continue our collective work to turn these concepts on their head. This image of the pride flag reveals what is polluted in bourgeois concepts of sexual freedom and liberation. We keep at our project of liberating ourselves and our ideas of freedom from their grasp. On October 15th, 2023, we released a statement affirming the right of the Palestinian people to resist colonial domination by Israel. We chose to speak specifically as a collective of gay people who refuse coalition or identification with those who denounce Palestine on the basis of homophobia. Skip ahead briefly. Grief comes in many forms. There is the need to mourn and the unique impossibility of mourning when the loss does not end or cannot even fully be known. We try in writing in response to our moment to, and at the very least, remember and in our small way honor those lost to the human sacrifice machine of imperialism in Gaza, in the West Bank, in our neighborhoods, and across the earth. But one other way to honor those lost is to recognize that resistance to inhuman sacrifice is itself an exalted task. As we write these words, one of us could hear the Queers for a Liberated Palestine march from our window. It is in the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, in the face of another year of their long war, that we find the most radiant, life-giving image of pride. Seems particularly resonant today, as we can also hear, right, the marches that have not stopped in solidarity with Palestine. Should I read from the statement or?
Yeah.
Sure, there's some, I think, perhaps replication, but actually maybe what I would turn to is our statement on PACB. I don't know if everybody here in the room is familiar with PACB, but it's one of the things that we signed on to, I believe in October or November. It's the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. So I'll just read a little bit from our statement on that and encourage you all to sort of look up, what PACB is, and if you're a part of academic or cultural institutions to start conversations about what it means to sign off on PACB. The Pinko Collective stands in solidarity with the people of Palestine and commits to the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. The Pinko Collective affirms the right of the Palestinian people to liberate themselves from Israeli colonial domination. We call on people worldwide to use all means available to them to prevent this catastrophe and defend the people of Gaza. And as we often say, and I think bears repeating whenever we can, there's a particular responsibility as a collective of gay people that we have an obligation to reject the enlisting of gay rights in service of genocide and colonial domination. Supporting Palestinian liberation is part of the struggle for freedom for all queer people. We reject the slander that to support Palestinian liberation somehow means to endorse homophobia. Israeli society's limited and superficial claims to gay inclusion rests on the systemic exclusion of Palestinian queers. The only route to a sexually free Palestine can be through a Palestine free from Israeli domination. A free Palestine requires the mass resistance of the Palestinian people, joined with international solidarity in dismantling the basis of the Israeli state. So again, in solidarity with those fighting for a liberated and free Palestine, and in line with the Palestinian campaign, the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, we commit to such a boycott. And again, you can find sort of the details of that very easily by searching Crackbait. So I'll end there. Thanks everyone for being here. So we will be hearing next from Max, reading from a theoretically daring new work, I would say, on sexual policy.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? This is good. Okay. Thanks, Lou, and thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to read from my essay, which is called "What Was Sexual Liberalism?" I was trying to find a way into thinking about the sort of overall sexual scene or regime, maybe in a historical way. Over the past couple of years, I've seen a number of kind of interesting transformations take place, and I was looking for a concept that might help me find a way in and help others think about what's actually going on in a slightly new way. I'm not going to read from the whole thing because it is kind of long, so I may just I'm going to start from the beginning, and I may just stop in some place that may or may not be a satisfying conclusion. So we'll see. Did a sexual revolution ever take place? In 2009, this magazine began publication with a manifesto reflecting on the half century since the Stonewall Rebellion announced the contemporary phase of what we now call the queer struggle. Then we remarked on what was a revolutionary development in at least one sense. We said the horizons which sexual liberationists were pursuing are now in some ways aground. So revolution in the sense of an overturning. We found the defense of these earthly horizons urgent, if insufficient, and we called for the courage to pursue new ones. But in just 4 years, the ground seems to have shifted. Cracks now appear underfoot, and something uncanny gropes its way out. Minor conflicts in this light can seem like foreshocks of an epochal overturning, bringing what once felt like certainties into question. Now it's no longer even clear what might be overturned. Given the way that some indicators are trending, we may soon look back on the present as the high watermark of a certain form of sexual freedom. But the pictures that these indicators paint of this form is somewhat muddled. In the United States, for example, legal rulings, which for decades have shielded sexual practices from the state through enumerations of the right to privacy, all seem to be coming up for extremely hostile review, while more and more people find their way to depart from the sexual scene that these rights guarded. Greater rates of queer or trans identification appear to each successive generation, while reported frequency of sexual activity has declined across the board. Some partisans of sexual freedom even take a projected decline in private car ownership, which is extremely capital and resource intensive arrangement, which required so comprehensive a level of coordination of class conflict, imperial violence, and metabolism of nature that it names an entire epoch of capitalist civilization. They take this decline as a portent of the end. Without cars, you don't tend to do the things that teenagers do in the back seat, the evolutionary psychologist Rob Henderson opined recently. A National Review blogger put it more bluntly: liberty, sex, and driving are intrinsically linked. This three-way equation of cars, sex, and freedom, or freedom as sex as a car, is certainly suggestive. But the proper name for the whole situation, the sexual conjuncture, you could say, has remained somewhat obscure. The enemies of the present know at least that it has gone too far. For them, sex today has lost the wisdom of restraint, which is what truly makes you sexually free. There was a recent roundtable on the topic at the Wall Street Journal. They invited reactionary feminists to argue in favor of repression, reversely on the grounds of pleasure. She calls for no more openness, more intimacy, handwritten texts by mail or nothing at all. So here, as usual, the position of reaction declines to articulate its own system of values, soothing itself instead with the promise that things will go back to the way they're supposed to be once the threatening present has been overthrown. Repression as a return to sexual freedom and pleasure after the catastrophe of too much of the same. This rhymes with what the theorist Sita Balani's recent book argues, that is sexual freedom which throbs at the core of the modern political subject, which is it's the ultimate truth of the sovereign individual and lends all other values its distinctive flush. The reactionaries do have an idea of the name of the present sexual regime. They call it liberalism, by which they mean feminism, which they equate with the idea of the 1960s as a kind of licentious sexual or secular fall. There's a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by the British columnist Louise Perry, where she alternates between sexual liberation and sexual liberalism to denote her antagonist. Liberals are both the sex radicals who carried out this revolution and its current legatees. At moments, Perry draws on Margaret Thatcher's best remembered statement to accuse the militants for women's freedom of furthering some kind of a deregulatory agenda with regard to the sexual market. She says, feminists are sexual Thatcherites because they act as if there's no such thing as society, in the sense that they conspire against patriarchal social restriction. This understanding of the relation of the 1960s women's movement to the capitalist counteroffensive of the 80s, a decisive turn of fortune in a jagged century of shearing, planetary revolution, and bloodthirsty counter-revolutionary slaughter, with cycles of proletarian thrusts, which at points took the form of gender struggle, and snarling counterinsurgency in the shape of the father. This understanding is worse than useless, but it is decisive for her argument. It conceals its unity with Thatcher's project as articulated in the uncited coda to her infamous line, "There are individual women and men, and there are families." That is, the claims that the working class had ever managed to impose on the capitalist state would be shredded, and the costs for prosecuting a war against it exacted from the private wage earning household as debt. So to the extent that Perry articulates a counter-revolutionary program, as her book promises to, it is this: Thatcherism. But as a mouthpiece for a certain fraction of the capitalist class, she actually does leave traces of helpful insight from her efforts. Though she doesn't mention it, sexual liberalism is also the concept that perfumes all of the French writer Michel Houellebecq's rancid, influential body of work. His depiction of a post-68 society is the wreckage of a kind of utopian project, which brought on a new atomized hegemony, which was distinguished by male sexual access to women, has gained a very, very broad reception, sensitive enough as it is to the existence of social antagonism that certain readers can imagine they detect a class analysis in. With Houellebecq, as in other French novelist philosophers of white genocide, like Renaud Camus, who is the inventor of the Great Replacement theory, and Jean Raspail, who is the author of The Camp of the Saints, which is extremely influential on the fascist right. There's an unmuffled shriek of wounded hierarchy that travels internationally in their contemporary staging of the rape of Europe. Self-styled dissidents from the racial and sexual order, these men accuse it of failing to prolong its line. Maybe I'm going to skip a little bit, actually. So those are the enemies. Those are the antagonists. Okay. So the idea of a sexual revolution as the author of the present is perhaps the most ready popular historical concept of modernity on hand. But when exactly that revolution is supposed to have taken place is actually weirdly mobile if you look at it. Many invoke it to refer to the latest developments in sexual taxonomy or self-determination by imagining you're talking about like Tumblr or TikTok or something, even though the charge still comes from its compressed summary of the 1960s. However, a contemporary survey from the Kinsey Institute was confident in asserting the absence of far-reaching changes in sexual norms in the United States. If there was a sexual revolution in the 1960s, the researchers went on, it apparently was not experienced by the great majority of women and men interviewed. This was published in 1989, but it was released in the 70s. Meanwhile, the term itself was then already on hand because it had emerged to capture a shift in sexual form roughly 50 years prior. As a 1964 Time magazine article on the second sexual revolution had it, men with memories ask, what again? Some of its more delirious critics even place the hour of the sexual revolution far further, creatively fusing it with the Jacobin Revolution of 1789 and placing the libertine Marquis de Sade, fresh from the Bastille, at its voluptuous head. So the promiscuous datings of this concept give away there's a different concern than historiography. In the Kinsey Institute report, the researchers suggest there's a kind of self-authoring effect from public speech about sex, where each mention served to sustain it further, concretizing a topic of conversation into a cultural reality. Perhaps. The debut of the phrase came amid a wave of sex hysteria and sex discussion, as an editorial in 1913 put it. But the question is what there was to talk about. In the early 2000s, the sociologist Goran Thurborn compiled a centennial balance sheet of changes in family form, assessing and comparing the global state of legal patriarchy, marriage, and sexual regulation in family systems at the turns of the 20th and 21st centuries. If there was a revolution that cleaved these years in two, how had it left its mark in law? What struck Thurborn about the past 100 years most was not sexual form, but patriarchy. This was the true big loser of the century. In its last quarter in particular, it saw the most rapid and radical change in the history of human gender and generational relations. The most widespread feature of the family in 1900 that he surveyed, the law of the father, which once determined practically every living human's conduct in marriage, inheritance, household formation, schooling, etc., and variegated obviously, but nearly universal form worldwide. It succumbed in 3 acts spanning a century to an equalization of formal rights in legislation, if not in practice. Thurborn seems to find some humor in reporting that the role of the communist movement was crucial, if not overwhelming, in overturning this venerable tradition. The Bolsheviks famously undertook early revisions to family and marriage law, even within the teeth of civil war, setting an example for revolutionaries globally in the first third of the century. And the first major legal reform that the Chinese communists promulgated after consolidating rule was the marriage law of 1950, abolishing the feudal marriage system. And following the global rebellions of the 1960s and 70s, it was activist communist women organizing across the UN system who constructed international agreements to carry out global legal and economic forms in the latter third of the century. But as Lenin put it in an address on the 4th anniversary of the October Revolution, the abolition of the inequalities of the sexes was to be understood as an achievement of the bourgeois democratic elements in the revolution against what was a disgusting survival of the feudal order, which only Bolshevik legislation had been able to carry out. So formal sexual equality was a face of modernity. It was the work of the bourgeois revolution against pre-modern social relations, but it took the intercession of this communist movement to impose it in history. And then I stopped to talk about a pamphlet by Andrei Platonov, where he kind of describes what the experience of this new sexual form within communist revolutionary Russia, Soviet Union, is like. It's called the anti-sexist, and we made a little diagram as to illustrate. Let me see. The sexual form of capitalist society, which Platonov has Keynes, Mussolini, and Ford all agree on, is presented as a historically novel social arrangement, shipped into human reality as a gadget. This arrangement can also be described as sexual liberalism, as the scholars Estelle Friedman and John D'Amelio do in their 1988 book, Intimate Matters, which surveyed the development of sexuality across 4 centuries of settlement in the United States. Their use of the term appears to have made no direct impression on Welbeck and company, though they speak as participants in the liberation movement that the reactionaries set themselves against. The two describe sexual liberalism as the latest phase in a relay of hegemonic sexual forms, a view of erotic expression that contrasted with previous emphases on restraint through its beliefs in heterosexual pleasure as a value in itself, with sexual satisfaction a critical component of personal happiness and successful marriage. The banality or seeming self-evidence of these claims from a contemporary perspective is an indication that the situation they describe still obtains, and a measure of how sex works to naturalize the movement of history. But if you notice, these are the very terms which our reactionary feminists argued for return to repression, pleasure and satisfaction as ends in themselves. I'm gonna stop there. I think that's probably enough. Thank you all.
I'm going to read from an editorial called Against Trans Eradication that we wrote around Pride last year. 21st, and it's our effort to try to say something slightly different. 21st century radical queers have long churned our ire against racial capitalism and its shallow sexual liberalism. As one historically notable collection put it, we have said we are against equality. The critiques are now easily at hand. Corporations offer us rainbow marketing while oppressing their queer workers. Politicians espousing pro-gay rhetoric massively expand prisons or launch new wars. The police paint their cop cars in pride colors while beating us and shooting us in the streets. Liberals now welcome us into their institutions of marriage and family. Their recent homophobia inverted into an expectation that all we want is to conform. Love is love. And the sickening machine of racial capitalism continues. We resist assimilation. We speak of gay shame. We refuse their rainbows. Yet this year, rainbow capitalism doesn't exactly seem like the main enemy. In the weeks leading up to June 2023, corporate pride displays drew renewed fascist attention, offering liberal managers a chance to halt unionization drives and capitulate to the threat of violence. Far-right politicians, multiple targeted mass shootings, on-site death threats, and a coordinated anti-trans media campaign have changed the tenor of pride, which only recently seemed fully recuperated by liberal conformity. Though this year the violence was minimal, Boise's foiled mass terror attack by the Patriot Front last summer weighed on many. The main focus of the anti-queer fascist violence campaign has had a particular figure in its sights, but it is showing initial signs of broadening. They target their ire at trans children and the adults who support them. Fascists expressed florid contempt towards parents of trans children, their doctors, and drag queen performers who perform for children in all ages groups. The trans child has become their obsessive focus. Initially, the organizing against trans children seemed to emphasize the familiar liberal trope of parental rights. In sensationalized newspaper articles and news clips from both right-wing media and the bastions of liberalism, parents hostile to their trans children reported feeling pressured by doctors or liberal media or trans activists to not pursue their desired conversion therapy. These parents seem to panic at the idea their children may be anything other than narcissistic extensions of themselves, worried their offspring would fail at repeating binary gender tropes and normative heterosexual fantasies. Gender reveal parties seem to embody this parental anti-trans panic with their attendant wildfires and fatal accidents. Trans radicals, of course, have always challenged the notion a child's gender should ever be up to parents and doctors, let alone chromosomes or birth assignments. Liberal media pundits, rather than uniting to oppose this fascist onslaught, have instead offered a cover. The Atlantic and New York Magazine have repeatedly published articles developing right-wing talking points on trans children, manufacturing a panic about what they suggest are rash gender transitions. The New York Times went a step further, condemning and punishing the hundreds of staff, journalists, and media workers that publicly criticized the paper's repeated anti-trans bias. While liberals see in the fascist mobilization an opportunity to discipline the left, recently the far right has dispensed with the liberal pretense of parental choice. Now, trans-affirming parents who had little voice in media narratives about parenting trans children find themselves facing intensifying harassment and hostility. They and their children face a campaign that integrates multiple state legislative efforts to ban gender-affirming care, a mounting reality of armed terror violence, and genocidal rhetoric. States are mobilizing their infrastructure, the family policing system against parents of trans children, previously developed and used to target and separate Black families living in poverty. The shift between parental rights to the attack on trans supportive parents is driven by fascists narrowing who they consider legitimate families. The far right is increasingly explicit. They seek the, quote, eradication of transgender people from public life. This is not hyperbole about their aims. Within years, it is not implausible that gender transitioning could become extremely legally and medically arduous in much of the United States, that institutional support for trans people could be eliminated completely, and that trans people could face open and routine violence. This is already happening and could spread and intensify. The UK's anti-trans movement, a bit less Christian and a bit more centered on the false trope of women's rights than the anti-trans movement in the US, seems far along a similar path. The trans struggle has much to offer an understanding of gender fascism and its implication with liberal inclusion. Black trans women have long pointed out the potential trap of equality, visibility, and inclusion. Leading activists like Miss Major have pointed out that visibility can also reveal where we are to the enemy. Liberalism was always a shaky ground on which to advance, always excluded large numbers of BIPOC and poor, queer, and trans people, and always massively truncated the horizon of freedom. These Black trans activists join a broad historical critique that locates the germs of fascism in the status quo of racial capitalism, imperialism, mass incarceration, and day-to-day policing. But however critical we may have long been of the sexual liberalism of equality, there is something terrifying in seeing it under violent assault by those who declare their intentions are our complete eradication. Like corporate pride, the liberal assumption of parental ownership of their children's bodies and identities was little defense against fascist attacks. The defense of trans and queer life will require a mass movement with multi-pronged strategies. These strategies include armed self-defense and anti-fascist violence, the collective power of organized labor, and pressuring liberals to extricate themselves from anti-trans rhetoric and politics as examples. But anti-fascism has also long been deployed by self-declared communists and others to suppress insurrectionary and revolutionary working class tendencies or to force alliances with racist liberalism and capitalist states. Something else is needed, a politics capable of joining a mass multi-tendency force against fascism while not capitulating to an inadequate and untrustworthy liberalism. Gay communism has never exactly been an identity for Pinko. We have not often written as gay communists, positioning ourselves as the voice of some sort of movement to which we dictate strategy. We have described ourselves as a collective for thinking gay communism, treating gay communism as a problematic, a theoretical and practical problem to be worked through and thought alongside. This does not preclude us from making political assessments or calls, but complicates and nuances the positions from which we do so. It is self-evident we need an effective movement against trans eradication capable of meeting the current moment. Such a movement will have to be discovered and developed collectively in mass struggle, alongside perhaps arguments and conversations we hope to contribute to and join. One thought that helps us in trying to imagine past the fight against trans eradication, the gender desire of trans children themselves. One of us was involved in the first 3 years of the later renamed Philadelphia Trans Health Conference in the early 2000s. In the first year of the conference, a cis mother came asking about programming for parents of trans children. The trans or gender nonconforming child is long been a subject of study and fascination amongst researchers, but actual trans inclusion of trans health and trans movement spaces was still quite rare. By the third year of the conference, 24 pre-adolescent trans children came with their families. Now, out trans children are present in schools and youth groups across the country. Fascists ascribe this development to groomers, some liberal transphobes to overactive doctors, others to genetic or chemical contamination. Whatever changing social circumstances have enabled these children to speak of their rich and complex relationships to gender, it is clear the desire of the children themselves is the central driver of everything that is formed in their support. Trans desire has always long exceeded the existing parameters of sexual difference, racial capitalism, and state policies. Trans desire, now taken up by masses of children, is taking us all somewhere new, demanding us to recognize the possibility of a reordered world that comes with it, a possibility that can't be managed or foreclosed. This begins simply with individual transitions and their social effects, the articulation of a personal desire, a need in a world that is not easily accommodated. In a liberal politics of inclusion, the political horizon stops here with a minorly reconfigured world that distributes oppression more proportionately. But in the current fur around trans children and their support networks is another faintly glimpsed possibility. The collective power of these dreams, their shared force in demanding a different kind of world, could push beyond the confines of state approval and parental tolerance. Enduring widespread poverty and state violence, trans people have played leading roles across multiple recent rebellions and revolutionary social movements. Trans radical writers are pushing new theorizations of class society, the state, and struggle. In a society that privatizes care into isolated private households, true shared freedom for trans children could only come through the overcoming of racial capitalism. This shred of possibility is why the movement is both terrifying to fascists and electrifying for the rest of us. Fascists have proven themselves to be strategic. They have chosen this moment to move towards complete eradication because the possibility of this overcoming is so frightening and so powerful. Some tried to reassure panicked liberals by emphasizing that the increasing number of trans children will soon level off, inanely equated it to left-handedness. What if they were wrong? What if the absurd, fabricated fears of transphobic fascists contains a kernel of truth? The trans desire will destroy and remake the world. The trans children are heralding a future horizon that we can't easily imagine. The trans liberation will be the end of what we know and the beginning of what we could become. So we have a few more minutes and we promised you all a discussion. So I want to invite my co-editors up here, and you all can make comments or questions or insights, illuminations on this week, on the political moment, on the problematic of gay communism, or whatever you'd like.
Feel free to take the mics off. Let's take the mic.
Yes, in the back.
It was quite stunning as I got you the images. The police action killing anyone.
Yeah.
And the invasion of the capital of Los Angeles. Young teenage quote unquote students with sticks, stones, bricks, just like their home.
Just like what?
Just like they do with us.
Yeah.
It was the most, the only violence I had seen before was the sort of brute force of the police department across the country. But just stepping back for a moment, how do we look the best of the colleges, quote unquote, the most expensive of the colleges, quote unquote, that now have said they're going to suspend and perhaps not graduate students that have been paying, families have been paying, with their scholarships paid $90,000. What does that mean? It's almost like I think that the RCP might have a kernel of truth when they say revolution now, because this is such a wake-up call to these privileged, quote unquote, or students that were going to enter the privileged world because of where they've been educated. And now they're told that that's going to be the record. Their whole lives are put on the line because they believe that the genocide was why they were there. And APAC has been so successful in getting politicians to talk about anti-Semitism, not to say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist, but the Jews that were in these, well, who are they? What are they? What does it mean to be a Jew? I mean, so many questions that are going back to seeing, just like watching buildings fall and dead bodies everywhere in Gaza on television. This morning, to see the police in such a fascist attack. The police were, they had complete liberty. And this Black Giuliani, who's the mayor of the city, had just put them in, same with SWAT teams going in to peaceful settlements. What are we to make of it? What are you to make of it? Gay communists, what are we to say?
You want to say something?
I would just, echo a lot of your sort of just like what is to come after this sort of maybe is what I'm hearing a little bit in your question, and what I was sort of feeling last night and waking up this morning in terms of, I did my undergrad at Columbia and I currently teach at NYU, so I've been sort of going back and forth between encampments. And just thinking about sort of my experience in higher education as somebody who is the first in my family to possibly even ever consider going to school like Columbia, and certainly the first to get in. And there's this kind of sense that us this generation of perhaps people who enter the university under mandates of diversity inclusion were meant to kind of save the university from itself and make it relevant and sort of resuscitate it in some way. And I think we're in many ways, not just even not my generation perhaps, but actually the one coming after has proven, right, that they will not save the university because that, is not worthy of saving. And it's just to underline what you're saying about the fact of how much these things cost, right? That students are going, at NYU, we're I think the most indebted undergraduate population in the country. And so these students are going into massive amounts of debt to have the cops called on them, right? To get this kind of like lesson in empire and its reach. But I don't know, there's something, there's a Native Studies scholar, Sandy Grande, who talks about hospicing the university, instead of bringing us in to make it live, what if we were brought in to help it die? And I think that this is also maybe what the encampments show, right? Is this kind of, we're not going to try to rescue this institution, but rather try to think of what is another way of actual education for people and socially relevant education, right? Education that's not premised and dependent on a total sort of reliance and support of Zionism in its most genocidal form, or perhaps the only form that's possible for it. And so I've just been thinking about this and in terms of gay communism as well. And I'm curious what you're all thinking and you all who are here in terms of, I guess, the ever-present question between like insurrectionary forms and institutional forms and the possible relationship between this. Is there a way to create new institutions that are, radically different than the ones that we've our lives have been structured by, and I'm thinking particularly of the university, but I'm sure there's some other examples we could think of. So yeah, I'll sort of leave it there, but thank you for a series of questions of which I've only touched a few.
A few 3 points come to mind for me. One is, I think your question very aptly identified the very deep connections there is between these police forces being called on students, the Zionist terrorist thugs that attacked the encampment at UCLA, and what's happening in Gaza, right? The actual IDF conducting its campaign of genocide. And these people like literally all know each other and all train together, right? They are the same forces in many ways, in a way that I think has become quite transparent. And they are very deeply tied to, all these online trolls are going on and on in support of the genocide. So, that kind of implication is very clear, but then the place of some of our articles touching on the empty place of liberalism, right? That these police are being called by university presidents who don't want to have to divest from weapons manufacturing, right? And that like liberalism's always been a shallow and quite weak ally, but like it's catastrophic implosion over at least since 2016, where there's no we had the biggest mobilization in American history in terms of mass participation, in terms of the portion of population in Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd Rebellion. And not a single city government substantively tried to institute any comprehensive police accountability at all. They didn't even really try, right? And it's very striking sort of how the role of liberalism to co-opt and absorb protest into reform and then to semi-institutionalize it in a way that robs it of its revolutionary edge, they just aren't doing it at all. And it's not clear they remember how, it's not clear they want to, and it's not clear they would be capable. And that creates a kind of very chaotic political moment for the rest of us. And on Twitter today, I said, Happy May Day to the Workers International, the global struggle for the liberation of Palestine and against colonialism and genocide everywhere. That the movement is really, I think, quite extraordinary in many ways, right? That it goes directly against Zionism has been an important part of American liberalism for a long time, and even an important part of the American left for a long time. So directly challenging that, it has this sort of very strong cadre core, the Palestinian diaspora, like generations of militants, and it has the kind of moral clarity of a generation being like, I am looking at lots and lots of murdered children on my phone every day. And like, this is outrageous. I don't want to live in this world, right? And I mean, just came from the May Day March, and I've been a part of the UAW for 14 years. And the UAW, is for a long time an imperialist union tied up with the defense industry. And we had like 500 people from the UAW mobilized at the march today as a product of the reform efforts and a lot of organizing. And I never thought I'd see that day, right? And I mean, without liberals trying to co-opt us into reform, it's actually very hard to run reforms. It's not like they call out the police on us instead. And I don't know what's going to happen. But the scale of the solidarity movement and its militancy and its fierceness around Palestine is in many ways unprecedented in the United States. And it is tremendous to see. And I think it's and around the world, its power and scope and depth and richness and the level of interconnection that the global proletariat has, right? Huge numbers of people around the world know how to read, have a phone, see images of these protests and care about what's happening in other countries on a scale that is absolutely extraordinary. And we don't have, a global revolutionary movement that seems poised to take over, but we have a movement that could be the foundation of that. That's quite remarkable.
I'll be really quick. I just want to follow on the point that you made, Michelle, about how there's our enemies are also all interconnected. They all know each other. They all network together. I saw this morning when I woke up and was trying to figure out what's happening in LA, that the very same people, the thugs who raided the camp, are the exact people who have been showing up at school board meetings to yell about trans kids. The same organizers, these Nazis from the Inland Empire, whatever. We know their names. They're in the same networks. And so to the point that like, yeah, some of what our readings tonight have been about, maybe like getting maybe less about proposing a gay communist program, which would be a little bit fanciful from our position, and more about identifying the enemies a little bit more clearly. I think that thing that I saw this morning was really striking to me, that like they know that they're fighting the same fight against pro-Palestinian protesters and against trans children. And perhaps something that we can offer is clarity that we are also fighting a single fight.
Yeah.
Thank you for this one, and I think just to maybe kind of continue the thread of Max's thought, and also I listened to an interview actually with Michelle and Sophie Burris, so thinking about family abolition and something that like I was really taken with this idea that especially in this moment of not falling back on just reactionary politics, but understanding how a lot of the discourse around this genocide, family is the locus of understanding and perceiving what a genocide is, which is the eradication of generations of people in one family, and of course the future of that family as well, and how that is a very compelling, I think, way to understand what is happening. So my question is, in thinking about knowing and identifying enemies, identifying the connections that a type of hateful, fascist politics, that students, that we're seeing students so bravely and courageously combat. How do we also advance the visionary politics? How do we talk about family evolution? How do we really thread the needle with, that is, I think that one brilliant connection you just made, with seeing how these struggles are inter.
I just, I have a lot to say, but I wanted to try to keep it short. So I co-wrote a novel called Everything for Everyone, and it's about global revolution. It's right there. It's a science fiction novel in interviews with fictional people in the future about their participation in a global communist revolution. And the second chapter is about the liberation of Palestine. My co-author is of Palestinian descent. And the liberation of Palestine in the novel becomes a really triggering event for the communist transition in the Middle East and ultimately around the world. And at one point in the interview, they talk about then I don't remember the word for it, but the specific kin structures that are unique to the Palestinian struggle in the context where people's families have been killed, or they need to very rapidly separate from their household because of bombing. And this is from the present, from the last, this was written before October, but from the last decade of the assaults on Gaza. And these kin structures are not based on blood, right? They're not based on direct lineage. They're based on mutual interdependence and survival in the course of struggle, where the children know households that they can run to if their building is going to be bombed. And they know people in the neighborhood who can take care of them. And the scope of the genocide, it goes so far as to eradicate that possibility as well, that people end up in refugee camps with no one in their extended social networks around them. But in many cases, these kind of care networks do survive in the diaspora. They survive in refugee camps. They survive in people fleeing to Rafah or people trying to make it back to their cities in northern Gaza. And they've been a really central part of Palestinian survival and struggle. And it resonates with a point that I make over and over again in Family Abolition. It is really central to my argument, which is not that actually people caring for each other, based on who they're related to, is necessarily a bad thing. What I'm critical of about the family are other features of that. But one thing I come to over and over again is that whenever large numbers of working class people enter into struggle together, they always have to go beyond the family structure as a form of social reproduction, a form of care. That what I call insurgent social reproduction, and we see it in encampments, and we see it in refugee camps, and we see it in occupations and barricades, that people might bring their families to the barricades, but they stop functioning as a private family and start functioning as comrades, trying to survive together in much broader networks of care that are really necessary to sustain struggle at all. And that it happens, that part of my whole point in family abolition is anytime you have a revolutionary mass movement, family abolition is actually a moment that necessarily is unfolding. And one of the things that I called for in the book is, people are concerned with understanding social movements or revolutions or working class struggle and want to support that, actually opening our eyes to recognizing how these systems of social reproduction always push beyond and against the family, that the family is not an effective site of mechanism of struggle. I think there are other ways besides romanticizing the family to recognize the horrific and massive devastation of somebody watching living through the deaths of huge numbers of people they know, huge numbers of people that care about them, huge numbers of people they're related to or that share their last name, that these, have really profound symbolic implications for people that both are within and beyond sort of how we romanticize or sort of reinscribe the family as a locus over and over again in politics.
Yes. I don't have a lot to say. I'm just going to point you to a really incredible essay that I read recently in Parapraxis magazine. It's not strictly about the family, but about the figure of the Palestinian child by Yasmin El-Rafai. And yeah, just to sort of underscore your point, she talks about how, yeah, there's, you know, obviously there's like a you know, an absolute and kind of spontaneous moral question when you see children dying, but sort of from the outside of the genocide and receiving that image as an image of sort of like innocence that's been transgressed or whatever because they shouldn't be targeted, actually doesn't get how terrible the genocide is. It takes the Zionism takes Palestinian children as political targets, and Palestinian society struggles with Palestinian children as agents. And so imagining that they like shouldn't be part of the conflict, which is true in a completely accurate sense, in the sense that nobody should be part of this conflict. The conflict should be over. Kind of like covers over the political dimension of how it's actually taking place. What do you think?
If there's any pressing questions, we can certainly.
Yeah.
I've been trying to figure out what can't you say? What can't you say? Because of the irrational response that comes from the other side. You criticize religion on both sides. When we talk about religions on both sides, and communists, I think all agree about the role that religion has played historically and the role that religion is playing. I'm contrasting this with family and how religion informs this idea of the family in us, rather than the revolution or autonomy should be important.
I think a communist analysis would focus less on religion and more on the question of land, which seems to be perhaps the more appropriate frame to understand it. I was saying I think rather than religion, the communist analysis would focus more on the material basis of land as the one of the kind of primary factors driving the not just the war now, but the whole Zionism and the resistance to Zionism. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but just to avoid I think obscuring that through the kind of narrative of civilizations or religions and conflict. Along with that.
Are we good on time? Do you think?
Yeah.
I think we have to follow up.
Sure.
Yeah, I want to speak to the same issue and thank you, first of all. I just wanted to speak to the same theme of the student movements. I'm just seeing that the potential people power by sheer body count alone and by virtue of willingness to defy law and brave NYPD, this could have crushed a material goal in the city. I don't know, my mind kind of goes to securing or protecting a squat for unhoused migrants, which is a huge influx. Things like that. I guess I would be curious to hear your thoughts on how can we extend the militants to other struggles here? There are large numbers of working class people all across this city, but the student movements kind of stay on the university. So do you have any thoughts around how do we spread this out?
I think that's a very good strategic question, and it's a question that we should ask ourselves and each other in movements. It is, I think it is true that the struggles can partially only unfold partially through the autonomous action of people kind of at their centers. So it would be without deep organic solidaristic relationships built over time, it would be quite weird to have a bunch of students just show up to defend a building, right? But what it would take is migrants being a part of a squatters movement, right? Being interested in seizing a building and then calling on the students for support, for example. And in May 68, like I'm very interested, for example, in France, the sort of interfaces between student occupations and worker occupations that happened. And, you know, there's been a lot of thinking about sort of trying to understand that interface. And I saw at various times in Europe, sort of immigrant communities being defended by leftists who were not migrants. And, you know, it's complicated, but that it makes a lot of sense to me that people mostly fight where they are. That people fight in their workplaces, they fight in their homes, they fight in their neighborhoods, they fight where they find themselves. And they sometimes fight for issues that go way beyond themselves. And that it's always complex and always requires a certain amount of nuance for people to depart from where they are to arrive somewhere else to fight on someone, you know, on somebody in someone else's home or space. And I think that can happen and it should happen, but it really needs to be driven by the people who it's on their behalf, right? Yeah. Students fight where they live, where they study. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I think most of us do as well.
So, you know, I'm a retired teacher. And I was thinking when you were talking about trans kids, would I be able to handle the integration of a trans child into the school population, understanding of what it was about? So a lot of what you're talking about for me is education. How do people learn to deal with pain and how that happens? You know, like I tried in a very progressive school in Ohio, and it was the idea of student is, I was thinking of all the slogans I had for teaching, and none of them were exactly applicable to trans, because I feel so uncomfortable with that issue myself, as to what that is, as how to be a good teacher, in terms of helping the person really understand that. And so I think it's really, I never thought about it until now. I think it's a much bigger issue than people realize, even though it's a very small portion of the school population.
That's a part of the point of that editorial, that the desire of trans children is making demands on all of us to seriously rethink some really basic things about how families are organized, how schools are organized, and how our social life is reproduced. And I think you're right to recognize how challenging it is a challenge for all of us.
I had a granddaughter who was 6 or 7, maybe older than me. And she came back saying that the boys wouldn't let her play ball with them. And she looked at her mother and she said, "Am I trans? Does that make me trans?" And I never really thought about it until now. I mean, you said took myself to remember. But that is really an incredible question for a young child to ask. To have that idea even available, let's say, it's a very telling thing as to how we need to educate children and who we are as teachers.
Well, thanks everybody for being here. I know it's quite a volatile day.
Yeah.
Yeah, glad to share the space with you. Please buy books, ours and others.
Thanks, Max, Lou, and Michelle. Thanks to everyone